Once upon a time, in the beginning, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, be honest, did one or more of the above set your mind on a narrative adventure? Could you see in your mind's eye the dragon in the castle emerging as you heard that fairy tale opening? Could you hear God speak and light show up? Or maybe you were invited to instead hear the fanfare of the opening title crawl of an epic where a backcountry farm boy has to save the entire universe from, well, an armor-plated space warlock. There's a reason why this happens. We're hardwired to engage with stories. From our earliest moments to our dying breaths, humans are storytellers and story experiencers. Christopher Booker writes, "We spend a phenomenal amount of our lives following stories, telling them, listening to them, reading them, watching them being acted out on the television screen or in films or on stage. They are far and away one of the most important features of our everyday experience." Stories drive our lives. Stories drive the world. It should come as no surprise then that good researchers have been using stories to inform narrative information and qualitative data for years. Qualitative analysis is extremely important within fields that are more interested in examining the what and the why of something as opposed to just the how of it. As Green and Brown point out, qualitative data is all about the nature of a phenomenon, not its measurement. In this speech, we're going to dive into 3 qualitative analysis studies on, well, leadership, because that's what this is all about, right? And see how they use their methodology and results to communicate their findings to the reader. So the first study that we're going to look at is called Antigone, on phronesis and how to make good and timely leadership decisions. In this study, Alicia Cantu seeks to put ancient wisdom that's planted within this Greek tragedy in conversation with modern leadership theory and practice. Even in her opening sentences, she's already working to build a specific image within the reader's mind. Hear how she begins her study. When witnessing a controversial authoritarian leadership decision, do you speak out or stay silent? When in a position of authority, do you listen to others with an open mind, or do you allow yourself to be wrong and to change your mind? The qualitative analysis is immediately at play, inviting the reader to start creating an understanding of the phenomenon from the very beginning before any data has been shared. This understanding is fleshed out and brought to life as she orients this conversation between Antigone and leadership around this idea of phronesis, or the ability to make clear, rational decisions in crisis while also staying open to feedback, and also the process of hamartia and metanoia, of sin and repentance, of error and correction. Bringing in recent scholarship and thought around these topics of leader bias, power dynamics, free speech, and leader-follower dissent, Cantu compares and contrasts scenes and characters from the tragedy with modern examples of leadership decisions that were made in the midst of crisis, like the Wells Fargo administrative situation of today, like how countries responded to COVID in the middle or at the beginning of this pandemic crisis, and even the 2008 U.S. financial crisis. While she does not use the same verbiage, Cantu ultimately concludes that phronesis and metanoia demand something very basic and yet crucial of the leader in crisis. They demand humility. When faced with opposition, crisis, and one's own bias, good and right decision-making is only an option for the humble leader. In our second study, we're going to look at chaplain leadership during COVID-19, an international expert panel. In this one, Zilagi et al. Used this study to ask what distinguishes hospital chaplains who were considered valued as integral leaders during the COVID-19 pandemic from those who were not perceived as leaders in their systems. Qualitative analysis studies on the subject, or quantitative analysis studies on the subject, didn't really give any kind of significant data to distinguish one from the other. And so our researchers turned to qualitative data instead, asking an expert panel to come together and to answer certain questions prior to this panelist discussion that they were going to have. All of the panelists were asked to answer the questions of what were the chaplain leadership factors, elements, or characteristics that stood out as having the most potential to shape the integration of chaplains and the value of chaplains' contributions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also answer the question of what leadership actions did chaplains take or could have taken to promote the value of chaplain contributions and integration of spiritual care and chaplaincy in healthcare during the pandemic. So during this panel, participants brought their answers together and then were asked to give their reactions to them, to share parallels they saw or where their experience differed. Researchers then compiled all of the data from the original answers that were given and from this conversation that took place and used a thematic approach to code all of the information into like categories. From these like categories with this qualitative data, they developed 6 distinct themes used to name and describe those chaplains that were able to become integral leaders during the pandemic crisis. Those 6 distinct themes were professional confidence, engaging in trust building with executives and managers, decision making, innovation and creativity, building integrative and trusting connection with colleagues, and promoting cultural competencies. Now, as with other qualitative data analysis, this study helps the reader to paint a picture of what kind of hospital chaplain would emerge as a leader during a crisis similar to that of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the picture it paints is, well, of a leader. Not all chaplains are meant to be leaders. Some work best from the sidelines or even the background. Now, while this means that they may be undervalued and overlooked in times of crisis, it doesn't at all limit or minimize the contributions that they gave during this time. This study shows that these 6 factors played a large role in identifying whether or not a chaplain had the necessary traits, skills, and behaviors to rise up as a leader during this. That's specifically what they were looking for in this. Now, this might sound like fairly simple reasoning and a fairly simple conclusion that they've drawn, but honestly, this is qualitative data at its finest. Through discussion, information sharing, and cross-disciplinary research, Zilagi et al. Have fleshed out and given life to a story that readers can engage, that they can relate to, and that they can experience within their contexts. The last study we're going to look at is called Scoundrels, Navigating the Dark Sexted Plus Schema, or DSPS, in Leadership and Executive Coaching Engagements. In this last study, Richard Kilberg, who is a leadership and corporate executive coach, is seeking to answer the question, why are toxic individuals regularly selected and elected as leaders by people who should know better? Now, as a coach, he has a lot of experiences that he can pull from, and he frames this study in a conversation that he had with the senior VP of a large corporation who was trying to determine whether or not she should fill a very important vacancy with an employee from within the company or whether they should go outside. There was one particular candidate from within the company that seemed, on paper at least, to check all the boxes. He was exactly what this position needed according to how he looked and how he acted. But as Kilberg is talking to this senior VP, it's clear that there's some kind of hesitancy that she feels. Like there's something about this person that isn't really clicking and connecting with her, and she has some reservations about hiring from within. As Kilberg discusses this with her, it becomes clear that there's something toxic and maybe even dangerous about this individual because they're toxic in one of the most insidious ways, a way that is really hard to pin down and name, and yet a way that still allows negativity and toxicity to enter into a system and corrupt it. This candidate is a perfect example of what Kilberg calls a scoundrel, someone who embodies the perfect storm of characteristics that comprise his dark sexted plus. They are narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, power orientation that puts the self over the other, sadomasochism, and charisma. Now, these first three characteristics comprise the dark triad, something that there's plenty of research on already, and something that Kilberg brings in all of that research to help name and describe. The second half are what he contributes to the conversation, bringing in scholarship for each one of these components and fitting them all into this puzzle that is the toxic individual, the scoundrel. He wraps up the schema description with a Taoist understanding of yin and yang, which you'll see right in the middle of this diagram from his study, talking about how all of these characteristics meet the perfect balance in the scoundrel and are the perfect storm of toxicity. By ordering his work this way, Kilberg paints a picture of each component characteristic and then places them within that larger schema, making it easy for the reader to understand and relate to his conclusions. Finally, he names the patterns of behavior that indicate such an individual and describes the type of culture and environment that creates and supports the scoundrel, ending with caution and advice for how to work with this person when that's the only option available to you. Kilberg uses qualitative data to create an image that clarifies and supports the creation of his dark sexted plus schema. For someone in a position like his, naming and describing the nature of the phenomena, exactly what qualitative data does, for this scoundrel, it's essential. Friends, we are, by our very nature, storytellers and story experiencers. Academic researchers and professionals know this and utilize qualitative data regularly in their work to help shape and communicate their results and conclusions to the masses. But they're not the only ones who do this. It happens more often in our world than you think. My sons both love to play the game Minecraft. Their absolute favorite part of the game is not building ridiculously complex structures or going to new parts of the world and exploring, or even taking the warps to different dimensions to see what's there. No, their favorite part of every time they get to play is when their designated time of play is over and they get to tell mom and dad all that they did and to show the final product. Now, when they do this, they don't go through and tell us every accounting of each resource that was used in the building of whatever. No, they show us the final product. And they give us glimpses of what it took to get there along the way. They don't know it, but they're using simple qualitative data to tell this story. It really is that easy. So what about you? How will you use qualitative data analysis the next time you need to communicate something to the masses? What story will you tell next?